Hello and welcome back. Sleepy What's It here with another miniatures video for you. In today's video, we're going to be doing a paint along for a White Scars Space Marine. For this paint job, I'm going to be using an easy to build Primaris Intercessor model, though any Space Marine model would be appropriate. This model, as you can see, is already assembled since I put a bunch of these together a couple of years ago now. As you can see, there's some white bits on him, so I likely painted him at some point and then stripped him. C'est la vie. If yours is already assembled, that's fine, but if you haven't already assembled yours fully, I have a suggestion to make. Specifically, I'd recommend not attaching the head to the body. Instead, have it on a chunk of sprue like this or on another holder, and just paint it separately. This will make painting around the head and the power armor much easier, with less mistakes and cleanup needing to be done later. Also, this really helps with doing non-helmeted models, so you can really work on the details of the face. Once everything is done, you can clip off the normal attachment point and just glue it into place on the model. If you've not seen one of my paint-along videos before, welcome, I hope you stick around. Also, I put up markers at various stages to indicate a good point to pause the video and replicate the steps I just described if you're painting along with me. They look something like this. Anyway, with all that preamble out of the way, let's get into actually painting our model. The primary color of White Scars is, well, white, so we're going to want to prime this model light color instead of the black that I've used on other Space Marine paint-alongs. I'm using a white brush on primer from Reaper, but any method of priming should work. You can brush it on, you use an airbrush, rattle can, basically however you want to. If you don't have white primer, a light gray would work fine too. Starting with a black primer would make your life a little bit rough though, since you're likely going to need many thin layers of our base coat to get good coverage over the black, so I'd recommend getting a lighter primer, especially if you're doing a lot of white scars. Anyway, you should pause the video now and go prime your model however you want. So here's what my model looks like after priming. Since the white of the primer doesn't cover as well as the black, it's a touch streaky, but we do have primer everywhere. I'd rather have a slightly streaky undercoat now instead of clogging up the details trying to get a perfectly smooth white here, since no one's ever going to see it since we're going to be painting over it. I'm now going to base coat the entire model using our base color Celestra Gray. I don't really care if I get in areas that aren't going to be white, so like where there's going to be red and metallic later, because we can just paint over those, though you don't necessarily have to paint like the entirety of areas that aren't going to be white. I'm focusing on getting complete coverage, but I do thin down the Celestra Gray enough that the brush strokes aren't showing up. If it's thinned down sufficiently, you're probably going to require 2 coats to get full coverage. I would pause the video now so that you could apply the base coat to your model. Here's what my model looks like with the Celestra base coat completed. This is a pretty dark tone, so we're going to be doing a lot of highlighting later to get us up to a white. Another option for base coat would have been the lighter Corax white from GW. I chose not to go with that color because, frankly, my experience is that paint is complete garbage. It's chunky and just difficult to work with. Anyway, mini rant over. Let's move on to shading this armor so all the gaps and crevices look nice. I'm going to be washing the entire model using a mix of 1:1 Drakenhof Nightshade with Lahmian Medium. Just wanting to thin down the intensity of the blue shade a little bit so it doesn't stain the base coat as much. If you don't have Drakenhof Nightshade, Non-Oil, which is a black wash, will work also, but you will overall get a more neutral effect than a cool white, and I find it looks just a little bit less crisp. You can pause the video now and go shade your model, and make sure you've let it fully dry before proceeding. Now here's what my model looks like after all the shade is dried. Even though I thinned the wash, there's still a lot of staining going on since we're working over white, so we're going to want to clean that up, those surfaces of the armor before we proceed. This is going to be done basically by the dry brushing with our Celestra Gray. You'll probably notice here that I'm not using a traditional Citadel dry brush or a generic flat tip brush for dry brushing. This is because we're doing a lot of big curved surfaces on our Space Marine, and when dry brushing using a flat traditional brush, you'll end up with a kind of a streaky, dusty appearance I'm not a big fan of. Instead, I'm using a cheap, soft makeup brush with a big round brush, which will help give it a very smooth dry brush appearance. Other than that, it's just the same basic technique. Dip the brush off into paint, wipe it off on some paper towel until it's only dusting the top of the paper towel ridges, and then tickle the model with it. Since we're wanting to clean up the gray, I'm doing both a downward and upward stroke, since I'm not really trying to create any sense of light directionality. I'm doing a very light dry brush to begin with, just to make sure that I'm not getting deep into the shadows and crevices that we just established. It's better to have to do multiple passes with your dry brush than accidentally dry brush too hard. You can pause the video now and go clean up your Celestia Gray. So here's what my model looks after some dry brushing to clean it up. To continue the highlighting and building up the white of our armor, we're going to be doing more dry brushing. The reason I'm favoring dry brushing here is twofold. First, whites are particularly amendable to dry brushing, since the chalky appearance that you sometimes get with dry brushing is just less apparent on white areas, because chalky appearance is overly white, so it's like you're not going to notice that as much. In addition, white paints tend to have weak coverage, so traditional layering techniques can be painfully slow to build up colors, so dry brushing tends to be noticeably faster. Our next color is going to be Ulthuan Gray, which is a cold off-white. We're going to be dry brushing again using our big makeup brush because we don't need to care much about precision here. Again, we're going to be doing an up and down stroke, though it's not as aggressively on the undersides as we do on the top side, so we are giving some sense of light directionality, basically leaving a little bit of the Celestia Gray poking through in the shadows. You should consider this to be our midtone color and the Celestia Gray to be our shadow when you're fixing things up later. You can pause the video now and go paint some Ulthuan Gray on your model. Here's how my model looks like with the Ulthuan Gray dry brushed on. Now, we're going to be actually applying the eponymous White Scar paint to our model, which, as the paint name would imply, is a pure white. This is going to be yet another round of dry brushing, but this time we're going to be only using downward strokes, trying to focus on hitting the top, sides, and edges of the model. This should help establish some sense of light coming from above, since the top side should be noticeably brighter than all the other sides. Since we did a lot of dry brushing to build up the color on the model, there might be some darker areas kind of showing up in some awkward or unexpected places. If there are, you can use Ulthuan Gray or White Scar as appropriate, thin down a bit to layer in those areas and clean them up. I didn't do this as an explicit step. Instead, I just kind of fixed things as I noticed them as I was working along. But I can get away with that since I'm using a dry palette, so the paint will stay on my palette indefinitely. If you're working with a dry palette, so you can't just leave your paint sitting out indefinitely, you should probably do your cleanup after you finish dry brushing here. You can pause the video now and go finish off the white of your armor. So here's my model with the white of the armor done. As I mentioned, there are some dark patches that'll need to be touched up, but we didn't. Most of the paint job is done here. Now we're going to move on to the red elements of the model. Since I'm painting a basic standard Space Marine, only the Aquila, aka the emblem on his chest, is going to be painted red. And, well, obviously the various other insignia, but we'll discuss that later. If we're painting a sergeant or a veteran, some of the other elements like the helmet or the rims on the pauldrons would also be painted red. You can go consult various references online for the exact color schemes. Anyway, to start, we're going to be basing out using Mephistoton red, being careful to make sure to not touch the white on the chest. The fact that pretty much all of the colors we're going to be applying now are going to easily cover the white noticeably slows down the paint job for me, because you just need to be careful. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time cleaning up, because we just want a really crisp, clean look with this. So, as I said, I'm basically painting a little bit slower and with a little bit more deliberation, but yeah, I did definitely have to clean up edges and such after each step. You can pause the video now and go base out the red elements as needed on your model. So here's my model with the Aquila based out. It really pops nicely against the white. The next step we're going to do is shading it a little bit so the depressed regions are a little bit more defined. I used a mix of 1-to-1 Carroburg Crimson and Lahmian Medium for this shading. As before, Carroburg Crimson, like Drakenhof Nightshade, isn't the most common shade, so you could use Agrex Earthshade as an alternative. It's just, overall, it'll get the same basic effect, but it might not be as clean looking after it's all said and done. Since we're dealing with a small area and trying to avoid messing up the white, You should be relatively sparing with how much you load up when you're brushing one time just to make sure it doesn't get everywhere. You can pause the video now and shade the red regions. Here's how the shaded red looks on my model. Now we're going to want to highlight the raised elements on the emblem just to make them pop and drive that contrast even further. Since we're working on such a small area, I'm just going to show both highlights that I applied back to back before giving you a pause point. The first highlight is Evil Skun Scarlet, as always thinned down to a workable consistency that would require about 2 coats to get full coverage. I'm applying it along all of the raised areas, like the back of the wing, the feathers, and all of the higher regions of the skull. As always, being careful not to let it fall into the recesses and ruin those shadows that we just created. The second highlight I'm applying here is Wild Rider's Red, which is a touch of an orangier red. For this highlight, we're going to be much more sparing, only touching the tops of the skulls, using the outside edge of the feathers and just like an edge highlight along the top of the wings, like basically a much more delicate highlight. You can pause now and go highlight the red on your armor. So here's how my model looks after the red insignia is completed, ignoring the heraldry that I have done that you may notice. We'll discuss that near the end of the video. The next step that I'm going to detail is painting all the black elements of the model. This will include the body of the bolter, the belt and its accoutrement, and the ribbing for the joints of the armor. If one wants, they could use a dark brown like Ronok's hide for the belt, which I do on other Space Marine models, but I was thinking dark brown would read as black against all the white on this model, so it's not really worth differentiating it that much. Also, the metallic areas are going to be using the same base coat, so while we're base coating the black, we'll do the metallics while we're there. For our base coat, we're going to be using Abaddon Black, making sure to thin it down and not overload our brush so that we have some semblance of control of it while we're painting. I'll let you go base coat all of the black and metallic areas of your model now. Here's how all the black elements look on my model. Very dark, very shaded. To create some detail, especially for things like the bolter, we're going to be doing a bit of highlighting along the edges of the black areas. The first highlight that I'm using is Mechanicus Standard Gray. When doing layering of highlights like this, I recommend keeping your paint quite thin so multiple layers are needed to build up the highlight, since it's easier to apply a second or third layer to enhance the highlight than it is to repaint if you go overboard with it. For the second highlight, which is going to be a little bit more precise, I'm using Administratum Gray, which for many sections is either just going to be a point highlight on a corner or a very thin edge highlight, if it's present at all. You can pause the video now and apply some highlights to your model. The final major color or blocking that we need to address on the model is all the metallic regions. I'm choosing to only do a gray metallic on this model, but for the bolter Aquila, you could paint it gold, which I've detailed in other Space Marine videos. For all the gray metallic areas, the elements of the bolter, vents on the backpack, the auspex, helmet pipes, the first metallic paint we're going to be applying is Leadbelcher. You can pause now and go paint those metallic areas. So here's how the gray metallic looks with our base coat down. For all these areas, we're going to want to shade it. I'm going to be using Nuln Oil. Since I'm on a pretty deep shadow, I'm not thinning the shade, but I'm still limiting how much I load up at any one time just to keep it under control, not spilling out onto white areas. You can go shade your model now and let it dry before proceeding. For highlighting, I'm only going to be doing a single pass of highlights using Stormfang Steel. I think it comes off with a perfectly fine looking industrial metal. If you want to push the highlights a little bit further, doing some point or edge highlighting using Stormhost Silver would be appropriate. You also can do like scratches or wear marks with it, but that's getting a little bit more advanced than I want to do in this tutorial. You should go highlight your model now. With all that done, we have the core of our paint job completed. There's 2 little elements, the purity seal and its parchment, that we should finish to make sure all the details are done before we dive into applying the heraldry to our model. For the parchment, I based out using Pallid Witch Flesh, shaded it using Agrax Earthshade, and then highlighted it using Pallid Witch Flesh again. For the seal, I did the same basic process, but instead used Screamer Pink instead of Pallid Witch Flesh, Since these are small, super important details, that's why I'm not doing any real complex highlighting here. You can pause the video now and paint your Space Marines participation ribbon before addressing the heraldry. Now on to the funnest part of the paint job, all of the heraldry. I'm going to be demonstrating how to freehand these elements, but I would highly recommend using transfers if you have access to them. Especially if you're painting more than one model, you'll take far less time using transfers, and generally you will have a much nicer looking model. If you're the type of person that can do freehanding very quickly and it's going to look really crisp, why are you watching my videos? You probably are in the wrong lecture. That being said, not all the elements on a White Scars paint scheme have transfers available for them, depending on exactly which company and squad and such you choose to go with, so you may have to do some freehanding. Hopefully, by explaining how I'm tackling this freehanding will help you kind of figure out how to do it for yourself. The key to freehanding is to break down the image into simple shapes, since basically everyone can draw a square, a circle, a triangle, things like that. But like drawing like complex things might be hard, but you can break them all down. This is a pretty standard drawing slash painting technique, though you may have heard of it in terms of 3D shapes like cubes and cones and such before. For the arrow on the right shoulder, there's two fundamental shapes that I can see there. A rectangle with a triangle sitting on top of it. So we need to define the corners of the shapes, then paint the sides of them, and then fill in the shape. Obviously, while doing this, we need to blow out those lines a bunch. That's really essential to the process. To fix these mistakes, depending on how big they are, you can either get away with just using White Scar or Uthlon Gray, but if they're noticeable, especially if they're noticeably saturated, you may have to rebase using your Celestia Gray and work up from there. Whenever I do triangles like these on the shoulders or any type of like angled things, they always look really round the first go I do this. So I end up needing to use my like the armor color to eat into the shape to kind of straighten it out. So I think it's actually needing to be a little bit concave to read as straight. Anyway, for the squad symbols that go on the knee, I'm just going to be doing a white-red split using a jagged lightning line. I can't recall offhand which squad this indicates, but, I liked it and it looked simple to do. The jagged line I'm doing has 2 points to it, so we can visualize the line is just the red section is just being two overlapping triangles on top of a white paint coat. The two triangles are relatively small, easy to do, thankfully. The final element that we're going to need to do is the White Scars Legion symbol on the left shoulder. If you have access to transfers, I exhort you, please use them instead of trying to paint this unless you're really confident, because this is tedious. I actually ended up having to do this twice because I screwed it up right royally the first time. The shape that we're working with the symbol we're working with has 3 core shapes to it. A red rectangle with a yellow rectangle over it, and then a lightning bolt that cuts through it. So first of all, we're going to lay out our red rectangle. Technically, the long sides of this should be slightly concave if you look at like actual pictures of the White Scars logo, but I really don't have the freehand skills to nail that consistently, so we're just going with a straight-sided rectangle. Once that's dried, I painted a smaller yellow rectangle over it using Averland Sunset, though Uriel yellow would work well too. Since yellow has such a poor opacity, you're likely going to need multiple coats to get full coverage. You need to clean up the edges of the yellow and reestablish the kind of red trim around it. I would use a similar sized brush to one that you do edge highlighting, and then like a really thin paint consistency and build it up that way. The final element that we need to paint on this is that lightning bolt, which if you look at it, I guess the right way, is actually composed of 2 angled trapezoids with a triangle poking off the bottom. Above the rectangle, we have our largest angled trapezoid, which will kind of establish where the bolt will be running. We can then paint a slightly smaller trapezoid offset by about half of the width of the first one, but this one's going to be overlapping the rectangle, and that will kind of establish the jagged points. And then finally, we will draw a triangle point off the bottom, but it's going to be offset again to establish the second set of jagged marks. You can do some cleanup and highlighting to make the symbol pop a little bit more, though, as I said, please use transfers for this. You can pause the video now and take a crack at freehanding if you have too much time on your hands. The final element that we have to do is basing out our model. Since we have a strong white and red palette going on, I'm going to be using Martian Iron Crust, which is a texture paste from GW that's red on our base. I have that completely applied, I'm going to let it dry. Once it's dried, which can take like, over an hour depending on how humid it is where you are, I'm going to wash it with Agrax Earthshade to establish some shadows and give it more of an earthy tone, or soil or dirty tone, make it look like stuff that's on the ground. Once the wash is dry, I'm just going to dry brush it using Astaroth Red, which is a brighter dry paint from Citadel to get some highlights on it. Though realistically, any kind of rusty browny red color like Scrag Brown or Squig Orange should work for this. I'd stay away from going a little too orangey with like a Rise of Dust, but that's mostly an aesthetic opinion since we don't have a lot of that orange tone in the rest of the model. And then to finish off, I just based out the rim using a matte black. With all that, our model is done, and he's ready to fight in the battlefields of the future for Imperial glory. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the video enjoyable. If you did, please give the video a like. If you want to see more content like this about painting and miniatures in general, please subscribe to the channel. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.